All right, so the first thing let's talk a little bit about two-dimensional arrays, and I've got this program example for us to look at that shows how to do some two-dimensional array processing. And so I've updated the program example. I used to not use camel case notation on my names, variable names, stuff like that. I used to separate things with underscores, separate words with underscores. But I'm trying to that camel case notation has become such a standard, and our book uses it and everything. So I'm trying to use that. So I updated the examples in the help file for your program 4 assignment so that it's like that. So, but let's look under in the home page. Look under no, not that. We're going to look under program examples. Program examples. And I'm going to go down to two-dimensional arrays. Okay. And I've got this Star Wars program. It's kind of silly, but it shows how to do two-dimensional array processing, basically. And I've got the old version here. It's Star Wars 0. That's the old version with the underscore names and stuff like that. The new version, and that's the old version stuff. I'm going to look at the new version. So it's the Star Wars program with updated camel case names, and Star Wars diagram with updated camel case names as well. And there's the input file there. The input file is the same. So I'm going to download all these things and load them into the compiler. I might have to do some copy and pasting. We'll see. So I'm going to get the diagram. The diagram is, we'll look at that in just a second. That's an Excel file. Yeah, so it just loads it up as text there. So I'm gonna copy and paste all this code here. See, and I think I'm just gonna use the dev compiler today. But you can use code blocks as well. But if you use code blocks, you'll have to set up a project and create it like that. Oh, I'll go ahead and use code blocks. That's what I'm doing in my videos. Let's see. Did I have a shortcut to that? Yeah, it did. Cool. Yeah, if you use dev C++, you can just create a new source file and paste it in there. I think in code blocks, I'll need to create a new project, new console application. I'll name this Star Wars program. Right, so I created a project, and I do that. I get my source files, and here's my main source file. So I need to just replace all this with what I copied and pasted from Blackboard. Okay, and I also need my input file. So I'll probably need to create a file as well. So I'm going to go to File and New empty file. Again, if you're in Dev C++, you'll just have to create a new file and paste in there. Do you want to add? No, we don't need to add it to the project. the input file doesn't have to be part of the project. Let's see. So here's my input. So I'm going to copy that. And then back over here, I'm going to paste it wherever that is. Control V. All right. And I need to save that with a specific file name, because in my source code, I said the name of the input file is going to be Star Wars Academy Input with underscores, Star Wars Academy Input.txt. So I'm going to make sure I save it with that name. And make sure it's in the same folder as my source code. Star Wars Academy Input.txt. All right. And let me just run this real quick and make sure it still works. Oh, it doesn't like my system pause command. I don't need that. Dev doesn't mind that. All right, and let me see if it created my output file. Star Wars Academy output. Cool. All right. All right, so we're going to go over this program, and I'm going to explain what it does and basically how to do two-dimensional array processing stuff. Okay. And I also have, there's another file. It was the Star Wars visual updated with updated names. So I'm going to load this up so we can refer to this. Okay. And this is just an Excel spreadsheet. All right, so what we have, this is kind of silly, but we're going to pretend like there's a Star Wars Academy where all the Star Wars characters go to school and everything, okay? And so basically, this is the input file. And what we have here is each different line or each different row, you could say, is a different Star Wars character, okay? And each Star Wars character takes 4 exams during the semester or whatever, okay? So, for example, Obi-Wan Kenobi, his exam grades are 95, 97, 98, and 100, right? Luke Skywalker has 98, 94, 95, 96, right? So how many different Star Wars characters do we have here in our input file? We have 10, right? So we have 10 different rows, you could say, and each Star Wars character has 4 exams. So there's 4 columns, okay? So what we're going to do is we're going to create a two-dimensional array, a two-dimensional integer array to store all the exams, okay? All the scores. And then we can have a separate one-dimensional array of strings to store all the names. And I purposely put the people's names at the end of each line so they can use getLine to just grab the name there. So, and I'm going to show you how to do some common two-dimensional array processing things. So over here on this diagram, this is going to kind of show you visually what everything's going to be. So I'm going to create a two-dimensional array. I'm just going to name it scores. And so a two-dimensional array, you know, it's a lot like a one-dimensional array, except you have rows and columns. It's more of a table, right? And you access the different parts of the two-dimensional array by using the indexes, just like we did with one-dimensional arrays. But you have 2 sets of square brackets And the first set of square brackets tells you what row you're talking about, the index for the row, and the second one tells you what the index is for the column. So if you were talking about this cell right here, or this this component or element, whatever you want to call it.
How did you get there?
This right here? Yeah. This is the Star Wars visual. It's up on Blackboard as well, I believe. This is in program examples, and yeah, cool. Oh, is that the Star Wars one or the weather one? Sorry. Okay, good. All right. So like this guy, for example, right there, he would be scores 4, 1, right? So you'd have two sets of square brackets. First set of square bracket would be 4, and the second one would be 1. So, and just like with one-dimensional arrays, the indexes start at 0. So the rows go from 0 to 9. The columns go from 0 to 3. Right? All right, so we're going to do that. And then, like I said, we're going to have a one-dimensional array of strings for the names. Okay, and that's of size 10, right, because there's 10 names. And then I'm going to show you how to do some common row processing things. So we're going to find the sum of every row. So in other words, all of these scores for row 1 added together, right? And so you have 10 rows, so you're going to have 10 of those. So that is a one-dimensional array. Does everybody see what I'm talking about there? So it's just the sum of every row. And if you get the sum of every row, you can probably get the average. So here's the average. It's going to be the row average. So in other words, for this application, it would be what is each Star Wars character's test average. The average is 4 exams. Right? And then I'll show you how to find the high and the low values in each row. So maybe, who knows, maybe the instructor wants to drop the lowest test grade or something like that. Well, you can figure out what the lowest test grade is for each student by doing this, okay? So we're going to find the highs and the low of each row. And so this is what we call row processing. And then I'm also going to show you how to do column processing. So down here, for example, we'll find the column sum and the column average and the column high and low. So in other words, if you're talking about the column average, what's the average score for all of exam 1s on exam 1? So what's the average of this column, right? Or what's the average of this column? What's the high and the low score in each column? So that's what we're going to do there. So that's called column processing. And you'll see that it's a lot like doing row processing, except we're just going to switch the order of 2 loops. We'll get to that. And then we're going to look at how to find overall stuff, right? So what's the overall sum of all 40 numbers here, right? And what's the overall average of all the test grades? And what's the overall high and the low of all of these? So that's what we're going to do. And so these are common two-dimensional array processing things to do. Does that make sense? What we're looking for there? So how do we do this? So I have an example program here that basically shows how to do it. And I have things split up into functions. And so let's take a look at the code. Rather than write it all from scratch, we don't have time to do all that. So I set up a couple of constants, numRow and numCall. We're going to use those throughout our program, like for loops and stuff like that. The advantage of doing that instead of actually using the numbers 10 and 4 down there is what if we had another student? What if another student came, for example, and we needed to add them? So now we had 11 students. Well, if you had hard-coded 10 in there everywhere, you have to go through and change every 10 to 11, right? But if you just use a constant here, all you have to do is change this one constant from 10 to 11, and it'll affect all your loops and everything else. So this is a good way to do it. So anywhere you see numRow in the program, that's just 10. Anywhere you see numCall, that's 4. All right, so let's take a look at main first. So here's our main function. And what I did here was I basically just declared all those arrays and variables that you saw in the diagram a minute ago. Everything that's there, these are the declarations for them. So let's look and see how to do that. So declaring a two-dimensional array, we haven't done that before. It's just like declaring a one-dimensional array, except you put two sets of square brackets, and you put the size of the number of rows first, and then the number of columns. Right? So int, so they're integers. The name of the array is scores. It's numRow it has numRow rows, which is 10 rows, and 4 columns. Okay. 10 rows and 4 columns. So that will create that two-dimensional array. And then here is the names array. So we just say string names, and then the size, which is 10, right? numRow. And then I'm going to declare all the row processing things. So we have row sum, row high, row low, and row average. Okay, and those are all of size 10, or numRow. Okay. And row average is a double. All the others are ints. And then I have the column ones. Column sum, or I named it call sum, call high, call low, right? And call average. All those are of size 4, right? Because I have 4 of those. And then the overall stuff, those are just single variables. They just store one thing. So we have overall sum, overall low, overall high, and overall average. Okay. All right, so that creates everything, right? That declares all those arrays and variables. And then a lot of the rest of the program is all about figuring out, having your code figure out what goes into them. Okay, and so the first thing we need to do is get some input. And so I've got my input file and output files here. So I declared those just like we normally do. Star Wars Academy input.txt is the name that I chose for the input file. Star Wars Academy output.txt will be the output file. I have a function named getInput. So let's take a look at getInput, and we'll see how to do it. All right, so here is getInput. So we're going to send in the scores array, the names array, and the input file. Right? So one thing that you might notice right off the bat is in the scores array is, so I have 2 sets of square brackets here, and I put the size of the second dimension here. I put numCall there, but I didn't put it here. Okay? So you might be thinking, what's up with that? And so basically, whenever you pass a two-dimensional array into a function, you have to put at least the size of the second dimension. Okay? You have to put the size of the columns. And basically, the reason is how it's stored in memory is not necessarily how we visualize it. So we visualize a two-dimensional array having rows and columns and stuff, right? But actually in memory, it's like one big, long, continuous list of memory locations. And so we need to put the size of the second dimension so the compiler knows where the dividing line is between rows, if that makes sense. So you can put the size of both dimensions if you want to. You could put numRow and then numCall, but you don't have to put the first one, but you have to put the second one. So just know that. So that's on my parameter list, okay? All right. So whenever we are dealing with one-dimensional arrays, if you remember, we had like a single loop, right? One single for loop that would repeat and kind of do whatever needs to be done to each element in the array. Well, it's the same type of thing here, but we have multiple rows, right? So it's kind of like we're doing the same thing multiple times that we did with one-dimensional arrays. So we're going to use a nested loop structure. Remember, a nested loop structure is a loop inside of a loop. So basically, whenever you're doing what we call row processing, your outer loop is going to control your rows, like which row you're on. So if you just take a look at that, for row is equal to 0, row is less than numRow, row plus plus. So that's a counting controlled for loop. It goes through 10 times. The values of row are going to be 0 through 9, just like the indexes for the rows. Right? And then, whenever you're dealing with a two-dimensional array and you need to go, like basically across and then down, stuff like that. You'll have this inner loop, and the inner loop controls the columns. And so look at the inner loop for call is equal to 0. So row and call are just the index variables that I chose. Okay, call is equal to 0. Call is less than num call plus plus. So that's going to go through 4 times. The values of call are going to be from 0 to 3, right? And so that's going to control like which element I'm talking about inside the scores array. So, and you have to read things in the same order that they're in the input file. So I have to pick up this number, and then this number, and then this number, and this number, and then get the name, and then go to the next number, and so forth, right? So that's how you do it. So because the numbers are first, I'm going to start off my row loop, and then I'm going to start up my column loop. And every time I go through the inner loop, it's going to pick up a number and store it into scores sub row call. So you think about the values of what we're talking about, like on the first row, for example, when these loops are going. So row is going to be 0, and call is going to go 0, 1, 2, 3, right? That's just like the indexes of my array, right? I'm talking about this guy, this guy, this guy, this guy. So it's going to pick those numbers up, right? And then it's going to pick up the name right after that. Where am I going here? So the next line says get line in file into name sub row. So one of the hardest things about dealing with arrays is you have to make sure that you are giving indexes and keeping track of which component you're talking about within the array. Right, so we're going to put it into name sub row. Okay. So basically it will grab those values. So was it 95, 97, 98, 95, 97, 98, 100. So it's going to grab those things. 95, 97, 98, 100, and get Obi-Wan. Obi-Wan Kenobi, right? I'll just put Obi-Wan. So it reads those things in. Right, and then the next time through the outer loop is going to do the same thing for the next guy. So was it 98, 94, 95, 96? Wait. Let me do this. Now I'm not going to type them all in, don't worry. Right, so the second time through the outer loop, it's going to pick up those numbers. And then get the name, Luke Skywalker. Right. The next time through the outer loop, it's going to get Chewbacca's. Right. He'll say Chewbacca or whatever it is, right? And then let me do just a couple more. So, and then it'll get Yoda's. And then the next one is Jar Jar. Jar Jar didn't do very good. Jar Jar Binks, right? And so forth. And until it reads them all in. All right, so does that make sense? And then once that nested loop structure finishes, it will have all that stuff read into those two arrays, the scores array and then the names array. Everybody good on that? All right, so that's get input. Let's take a quick look at the function call for that. So back in main, no wait, this is my prototypes. The prototypes are basically exactly the same as the heading, but you can take names out if you want to. Here was the call for it. So get input, and we're sending in scores, names, and in file. Remember, in calls, in the function calls, you only put names. All right, so once you get stuff in, then you can figure out some other things with it. And actually, if I were doing this from scratch, I'd probably at that point just write a little test code to turn around and output my stuff that I inputted, just to make sure that my input was working correctly. So you could just do something like copy and paste this code. Let's do it real quick, and then I'll comment it out. Just copy that code, and up here in main. And again, if you're doing it from scratch, you wouldn't have all the other stuff yet. You can just copy and paste that. And instead of inputting it, you could just do like a quick cout. Cout scores row column, and maybe put in a space. And then after that, maybe go down. No. Put an indel down here. So instead of get lining it, do cout names, and then go down the next line like that. So you could just, do a quick test to see if it's working or not. And actually, there's one thing that I didn't really deal with here. Anybody know what it is? Technically, all my names start off with a space, because when I'm reading in the numbers and I get to that getLine function call there that picks up the rest of the line for the name, my input's here. And so every name is going to start with a space, and I probably don't want that. In fact, if you take a look at my output file, see that space there? That's actually part of the name. So if you don't want that, if you don't want your names to have spaces in them, in your input function, you should probably deal with that. So you can just put in a ignore line. So it'd be something like this. Let's see, skip over the space. Remember how to do it? Infile.ignore, and then inside of parentheses, you probably want to skip over one space, or until you get to the space, whichever one comes first. The space is going to, well, they're both going to come about the same time. But if I do that, infile.ignore, it doesn't know what that is. Did I? If stream. What did I do wrong on that? Oh, it's a character, not a string. So single quotes. Sorry. Single quotes. So there you go. So now my names don't start off with a space anymore. So I dealt with that. That space that you see there, I actually outputted that space. Take a quick look at the output file. See, there's no space there anymore. It looks like there is, but that's not really there. Okay, so that's what I would do first. Get the input working. Gotta double check it to make sure it works. And then let me show you how to find the sum and the average of every row. Okay. So now we've got everything in there. So now I have a separate function that figures out what goes here and what goes here. for these two one-dimensional arrays. Okay. And you'll see the loop structure, the nested loop structure, is exactly the same as what we just used for inputting. So I have another function. The name of the function is calc row sum average. Calc row sum average. So I'm going to send in the scores array, and I'm going to send in the row sum array and the row average array, right? And I've got my row and column variables to keep track of what indexes I'm talking about. And notice the exact same loop structure shows up, right? So my outer loop is my row loop, and the inner loop is the column loop. So what do you need to do inside of those loops? So here, if I'm going to find the sum, remember you should always start your sums off at 0, right? Because we're going to be adding to that. So I need to initialize the sum for the particular row that I'm on to 0. So here's how you do that. Row sum sub row is equal to 0. So when I'm coming along, it will put a 0 there, like that. So you want that to start off at 0. And then this inner loop is going to go through and it's going to add numbers to that for that particular row. So I say, here's my column loop, and then inside of there I say row sum sub row, that's the spot that I'm talking about, I'm trying to figure out, is equal to itself, row sum sub row, plus scores row call, right? And remember this time through the outer loop, row is going to be 0 and call is going to be going up. So what is that doing? So basically it's adding to this. So it's going to do right, so it's going to do what? It's going to say, okay, row sum is equal to itself, 0, plus 95. And it puts it back in there, right? And then the next time through the inner loop, it's going to say row sum is equal to itself, 95, plus 97, right? Sorry, I can't do stuff in my head. So that's 192. So it replaces that with 192. And then next time, it adds 98 to it. So you get 290. And then the last time through the inner loop, I can do that one, adds 100. So you get 390, right? So that's what's going on. And we're finished with the inner loop there. So it finishes with that. And then after you've got that, you've got the sum for that row, for that particular row. And then to find the average for the row, just divide that by 4, or num call, right? So that's what that does here. So row average sub row, the spot that you're trying to fill the average for, is equal to that row sum's value divided by 4. So what does that come out to be? 290, I'm sorry, that's 390 divided by 4 is 97.5. And it does integer division, I'm sorry, it does floating point division there, floating point division, because I typecast those into doubles. So that will put 97.5 there. Everybody see what's going on there? So it fills that. And then, so that's one pass through the outer loop. So the next time through the outer loop, row will be 1. So it's going to be working and doing the same thing for row 1. So again, it starts this guy off at 0, and then it adds to it, right? So 0 plus 98 plus 94 plus 95, 96, and so forth. And what do you get on that? $383 for that row, and then divide that by 4, and you get 95.75, right? And so that just continues, right? So once you finish this outer loop structure, it will go through and you should have the sum for every row, and you should have the average for every row, right? So it just automates it with nested loops. Does everybody see how that works? Yeah, y'all are really quiet. It's really, I think it's kind of cool, you know, because it just does it really fast, obviously, because that's the whole point. So that's calc row sum average, right? Calc row sum average. Let's go ahead and look at the next one for the rows. So I'm going to skip down to the rows. So how about find row high low? Find row high low. All right, so that's these guys over here, finding the high and the low values of every row. So how does that work? Well, I sent in the scores array, the row high array, and the row low array. It's kind of like I did just a second ago. I have my same exact nested loop structure with one exception, right? Here, if you might notice that the column loop, the inner loop, I can start it off at 1, so we'll take a look at that. So here's my outer loop, which is my row loop. And so the first thing that you need to do inside of your outer loop is you need to initialize the high and the low for that particular row to something. And so if you think back what we did with one-dimensional arrays, we initialized the high and the low to the first element of the array, right? So here what we're going to do is we're going to initialize the high and the low for that row to the first number on each row. Okay? And so the first number on each row has a column index of 0, right? Back over here, all of these guys have a column index of 0, but the row index changes. So that's what we do here. So row high sub row is equal to scores row 0. And same thing for the low. Row low sub row is equal to scores row 0. So initialize that. So if you're talking about the first row, just to kind of trace through it a little bit, if we're talking about the first row, row is 0, column is 0. Oh, we haven't done that yet. But we're talking about row is 0, right? So it initializes the high and the low to 95, the first thing on that row. Like that. And then what we're going to do is we're going to look through the rest of them on that row. And if we find one that's higher, we're going to update the high. And if we find one that's lower, we're going to update the low. And so that's what this does. So my inner loop, I can start column at 1 if I want to, because I just initialized the high and the low to what was in the first column. So you could start it off at 0 if you wanted to, but it's unnecessary. It's just going to be an unnecessary pass through the loop. So starting with column index 1, go through the rest of them and update them if necessary. So that's what this if statement does. So if scores row column is greater than row high sub row, row high sub row, you need to update it. So row high sub row is equal to scores row column. And the same thing for the lows. If your current score, that's this guy, is less than the low so far, update what the lowest number is. So to kind of trace through what it's doing. So we initialize them to 95, so it goes to the next one, right? 97. So it says, is 97 larger than 95? Yes. So we update that one. Is 97 less than 95? No. So we don't do anything. There's no false path. And then it goes to the next number, 98. Is 98 larger than 97? Yes. Is 98 less than 95? No. And then the last one, is 100 larger than 98? Yes. Is 100 less than 95? No. And so there you go. And that's one pass through the outer loop. And then when you go through the next pass through the outer loop, row is now 1, so you'll be talking about the next row. So again, they start off at 98, and then we look through the rest of them. Is 94 larger? No, but 94 is smaller, so we update the low. Is 95 larger? No, it's not smaller either. 96 is not larger or smaller either. And then you go through, here's Chewy, start them off at 94. Right, 96 is larger, but not smaller. 92 is smaller. 88 is not larger, but is smaller, right? Just a couple more. We'll get down to Jar Jar, since those would end up being the highs. Well, technically not. It's not the high. Obi-Wan's 100 ends up being the high, the overall high. Anyway, so Yoda blew the curve for everybody, didn't he? So 100 is not larger or smaller. 99 is smaller. 100 is not larger or smaller. And then Jar Jar, they start off at 30. 45 is larger, but not smaller. 66 is larger, but not smaller. 77 is larger, but not smaller. So you see what's going on there, right? All right, good. And so that is row processing. And that's what that function does, and that's how it works. All right. How about the column stuff? So those are the row sum average and row high low. How about column sum average and column high low? Let's take a look at that. All right, so here is call sum average, and you'll notice that it looks very similar to the row version, the row processing ones, except the loops are reversed. So that's the main difference here. So when you're doing column processing, your outer loop controls the column, your inner loop controls the row. So you just switch the order of the loops. And so this function will find the sum, the average of each column. So notice here's your column loop, and so we want to initialize the column sum for each column. So that's call sum sub call is equal to 0. So back over here, that will put a 0 here. And then the inner loop is going to go down through the rows, starting with the first row, and it's going to add all those up like that. I don't have all those in there, so I'm not going to try to figure it out. But the inner loop will add them all up, and then after that, after your inner loop is finished, then just take that sum, call sum call, and divide it by 10, or num row, and that will give you the average for that particular column. So it's pretty much like the other one. The loops are just switched, right? And our indexes are a little bit different. You know, for the column things, you're using call. Anyway, how about the highs and the lows for the columns? It's the same type of thing. You switch your loops. So here is find call high low. Find call high low. And so again, my outer loop is the column loop, my inner loop is the row loop. I need to initialize the high and the lows to the number at the top, right, of each column. So the number that's at the top of each column has a row index of 0, right? And so notice here, call high sub call is equal to scores 0 call. So again, what that's going to do is going to initialize these to like 95, right? Because that's at the top. And then the inner loop is going to go through, starting with the second row that has a row index of 1. It's going to look through the rest of them and update the highs and low if needed. But it's going, instead of going across from left to right and then down, it's going up and down. It's going from top to bottom and then across. Like that. So what do you end up with there? So again, let's see here. So 98 is bigger, right? But not smaller. 94 is smaller. 100 is larger but not smaller. 30 is smaller but not larger. I think that's what you end up with on those. Jar Jar and Yoda are like the top ones usually. And so it does the same. And then the next time to the outer loop, you're dealing with this guy. So 94 is smaller. 96 is not larger, smaller. 100 is larger. 45 is smaller, and so forth. Like that. Everybody see what's going on there? By the way that we've done this, if you have multiple values that end up being the largest or the smallest, you're going to end up, the one that gets stored is the first occurrence of it, right? Because we're checking greater than and less than. If you wanted the last occurrence, you could do greater than or equal to and less than or equal to. That would give you the last occurrence of it. All right. So that gives you the highs and the lows of the columns. Well, there's only one other thing. It's the overall stuff, right? So we've got all these and all these. So how do you find the overall things? Like overall sum, overall average, overall high and the low? Well, the main difference is that we're not going to initialize things inside of our loop. So you'll see that. And so you have to decide, okay, do I want to handle this row processing, the row processing technique, or do you want to do it column processing technique? So in other words, which order are you going to put your loops? I chose to do row processing. That's what most people would probably naturally gravitate to. So here's a function called find overall stuff. So I'm going to send in the scores array and then all the overall things. So overall sum, overall average, overall high, overall low, overall low. And those things are all variables, right? So I need to make sure I pass those by reference. So that's why you see the ampersands. The arrays that I would send in to the other functions, remember arrays are always passed by reference. So I didn't have to put any ampersands or anything like that. All right. So here's the code for it. Here's my row and column variables. And here's where I initialize everything for the overall stuff. So overall sum is equal to 0. So make sure it starts off at 0. And then initialize your high and the low to the very first element in the array, which has a row index of 0 and also a column index of 0, right? It's the top left-hand corner. So in other words, it's going to start this guy off at 0. And these two are going to start at score 0, 0, which is 95, right? Yeah. And then you have your nested loop structure. So this is just like the row processing one. So your outer loop is your row loop, inner loop is your column loop. So what do you do inside of there? So scores row call, that's going to be the current score that we're dealing with, right? So first thing you want to do is just add it to the overall sum. So that's what that does. And then check to see if it's the current overall high and the current overall low. And if it is, update them. So that's what that does. If scores row call is greater than overall high, then update the overall high. And if it's less than the overall low, update the overall low. So again, we don't have to do them all, but basically, so it's going to add to that every time, and then it's going to check, okay? And it's going from left to right. So 97 is larger, but not smaller. 98 is larger, but not smaller. 100 is larger, not smaller. And it keeps going, and what do you probably end up with? You probably end up with Obi-Wan's 100 and Jar Jar's 30, I think. I think those are the smallest numbers in there. Oh yeah, and then you have the average, right? So after you've done all that, and you have this overall sum, so it's after my loop structure, then you can figure out what's the overall average of all the numbers by dividing the overall sum by the total number of numbers. How many total numbers are there in the array? 40, right? It's 10 rows and 4 columns. So you could also do it like this, num row times num col. That'll give you the total number of numbers. So it divides that by 40, and you get the average, the overall average, that guy. Cool, makes sense? All right. Very good. So that's find overall stuff. The only other function, I have a nice little function called output results, where I actually take all those values and I output them. So I wanted it to look something like this, and have a nice table. So what you see here, I didn't output the scores array, but here's the name, here's the row sum, here's the row average, row high and row low. Here's the overall sum, overall average, overall high, and overall low. And then down here to output all the column stuff, I wanted it to look like this. So here's exam 1. So here's the column sum for the first column, column average for the first column, high and low for the first column, and here's all the stuff for the second column, and so forth. So how do I do that? So this code right here just does the table heading at the top. And then I set up my floating point output. And then this loop, we only have a single loop here. We don't have that nested loop because I didn't output the scores array. So you only have the inner loop when you're dealing with the two-dimensional array. So here, this outputs one line of the table. So output the names, and I've got all these things in field widths. Output the names, the row sum, the row average, row high and row low. So this is just a matter of outputting the contents of a one-dimensional array. We did that with the Nolan Ryan program, right? So they're just like what we did before. And then output the dashed line underneath the table, and then output the overall stuff. Notice I use the same field width values down here to get stuff to line up. Right. And technically, I don't need that space there anymore. Where was that? That was back when I had the spaces in the names, the people names. All right, and so that outputs overall sum, overall average, overall high, and overall low. Right? And then to get the column stuff on the output, went down a couple of lines. This loop outputs all the column stuff. So I outputted the text exam number followed by the column index plus 1. Most people aren't probably gonna say like this is exam 0, right? They're probably not gonna call the first test exam 0. So they're probably going to call them exam 1, 2, 3, 4, right? But the indexes go 0 through 3, so I just added 1 to make it a little more traditional or whatever. So it outputs the column sum, average, and high and low for that particular column, that particular guy. All right, and that's it. All right, so you can take a look at the function calls and stuff for all those things too, right? So there's really not that much code inside of main, right? There's the declarations and the file stuff and the function calls. And then this stuff was just my test code. I don't even need that anymore. And again, when you run it, you get that. Cool. Anybody have any questions? So this is going to be your friend for your program 4 assignment. Okay. In fact, on your program 4 assignment, there's a lot of it that you'll be able to just go and copy and paste, like for example, calc row sum average. A lot of this you'll be able to just like copy and paste and then change some names of arrays and variables and stuff. All right, so I'm going to stop this video and we'll talk about the program 4 assignment.